Swing low. O chariot swing coming for to carry me home. Swing low. Sweet chariot stop. The promise of freedom. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation promised freedom to millions enslaved across the South. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, that hope had spread like fire among Mississippi's black population. Families who had endured generations of bondage believed a new life was finally beginning. They imagined land of their own, schools for their children, and the dignity of working for themselves. At Davis Bend, a plantation once owned by Joseph Davis, the brother of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, this dream seemed within reach. Joseph had experimented with giving enslaved people a level of autonomy before the war, and many freed families thought this would be the foundation for a fair future. Through communities echoed the promise of 40 acres and a mule, a symbol that real independence was possible. Near the Mississippi River, churches and small schools began to appear, bringing both spiritual strength and education. Yet beneath the excitement, fear lingered. Determined to keep control of the cotton fields that dominated the economy, many white landowners resisted change. Still, in those first years after the war, hope was powerful. For the men and women of Mississippi, freedom felt close enough to touch, and Davis Bend became a beacon for what life after slavery could look like. The Reconstruction in Mississippi. During Reconstruction, between 1865 and 1877, Mississippi became one of the central battlegrounds for defining what freedom truly meant. At Davis Bend, freedmen organized themselves into one of the most remarkable experiments of the time. From among their own, they elected leaders, managed farming schedules, and even created local councils to resolve disputes. The dominant crop remained cotton, but now, for the first time, the people who cultivated it could negotiate how the harvest would be divided. Their own parcels were worked by families, selling part of their yield while keeping food for survival. With wooden planks gathered from abandoned buildings, schools were built, and children who once knew only field labor sat on benches to learn to read and write. Centers of resistance and unity became the churches, offering both prayer and strategies for survival in a hostile environment. Visitors from other states described Davis Bend as a symbol of possibility, where black autonomy thrived in a land scarred by war. Yet challenges grew quickly. Nearby white landowners feared the success of Davis Bend, seeing it as a threat to their dominance. Aiming to dismantle what freedmen were building, violence, intimidation, and legal tricks began to spread. Still, for several years, Davis Bend stood as living proof that formerly enslaved people could govern, work, and prosper without chains. In Mississippi's Reconstruction story, it was a fragile but shining moment. The rise of the sharecropping system. By the early 1870s, the promise of true freedom began to fade as a new system took hold across Mississippi, sharecropping. At first glance, it seemed like an opportunity. Freedmen who had no land of their own could sign contracts to farm the land of former masters. In exchange, they would give a portion of their harvest, usually cotton, to the landowner at the end of the year. For families who had nothing but their labor, it appeared to be a fair deal. At Davis Bend, many believed that hard work would finally lead to independence. Under the blazing southern sun, men and women planted rows of cotton, dreaming that the next harvest would bring profit enough to buy tools, clothes, or even small plots of land. But from the start, the balance of power was unequal. Landowners wrote the contracts, and most freedmen could not read the fine details. Easily broken were promises, and conditions were set to favor the white owners. A bad season, floods from the Mississippi River, or falling cotton prices could ruin a family's chance to break free. A trap rather than a path forward soon became sharecropping. Instead of building wealth, freed families were locked into endless cycles of dependence on those who had once enslaved them. The introduction of false debts. Connected to sharecropping came another cruel invention, the plantation store. At Davis Bend and other plantations across Mississippi, landowners insisted that freedmen buy seeds, tools, and food only from their stores. Prices were inflated and every item was recorded as a debt against the family's share of the future harvest. A plow that might have cost a few dollars elsewhere was sold for double or triple. Bags of seed were weighed light but charged heavy. To survive, families needed these supplies, so they signed the credit books without choice. When harvest time came, landowners calculated the debts with numbers that never seemed to add up. No matter how much cotton was delivered, the storekeeper declared that expenses were greater. Instead of earning profit, families who had worked from dawn until night discovered they now owed more than before. Into a shadow turned this system of false debts. The cotton fields of Mississippi no longer had chains, but they had ledgers that bound families just as tightly. Year after year, children grew up watching their parents labor with nothing to show for it. At Davis Bend, what began as hope for independence became a cruel lesson in how easily freedom could be stolen through paper, ink, and lies. The cycle of dependency. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Every year at Davis Bend, the same ritual repeated itself. Hoping that this season would be different, freedmen and their families gathered nervously to sign new contracts. But the cycle of dependency had already been built into the system. Not only the fields, but also the legal terms of the agreements were controlled by landowners and merchants. These contracts tied families to the land for another 12 months, no matter how unfair the conditions. If debts remained unpaid at the end of the year, and they almost always did, families were forbidden to leave until the balance was settled. Of course, the balance never truly cleared. Manipulated with costs added for tools that broke, interest charged on unpaid seed, or even penalties for imagined laziness were the books of debt. Trapped found themselves parents who wanted to move to another county or start fresh in a different town. If they left, sheriffs and deputies, often allied with the landowners, would chase them down and drag them back under threat of prison. A cruel illusion was the result. The freed people of Davis Bend were technically no longer slaves, but their lives were chained by debt contracts that never expired. Their parents' obligations were inherited by children, beginning work in the fields almost as soon as they could walk. From one contract to the next, families passed, always hoping for freedom, always ending in disappointment. A life sentence in disguise became what looked like economic opportunity. A cycle of dependency that echoed slavery in every way but name. The role of white overseers and merchants. Behind the polished counters of plantation stores and the ledgers of local merchants lay the true machinery of economic slavery. Complete control over the books was held by white overseers and merchants, and those books decided the fate of every family at Davis Bend. Well enough to challenge the figures, few freedmen could read or write numbers. Even if they tried, the courts of Mississippi, dominated by white judges and juries, sided with the merchants almost every time. That a family's harvest had been smaller than reported could be claimed by an overseer, and there was no way to dispute it. Often on scales already rigged, merchants weighed cotton, subtracting pounds that had been honestly picked. At the end of the season, a family might deliver hundreds of pounds of cotton only to be told that their debt had grown larger. Many realized the fraud, but had no power to resist. Always in the background was violence. Anyone who protested too loudly risked beatings, eviction, or worse. The fields were patrolled by overseers, making sure work was constant and discipline harsh. Merchants, meanwhile, extended credit on purpose, ensuring that no family could ever fully pay. Deliberate was this manipulation of records, a calculated effort to maintain control. Together worked the paper contracts, the store accounts, and the false weights to create a prison without walls. A place where hope was constantly drained became Davis Bend, where families were tied not by chains of iron, but by numbers written in ink impossible to erase. The broken promises of land ownership. When the Civil War ended, across the South like a sacred promise spread the phrase, 40 acres and a mule. For the freed people of Mississippi, land meant everything: independence, stability, and the chance to provide for future generations. At Davis Bend, many families believed that this promise would finally give them the soil they had worked for decades without pay. They imagined planting not just cotton for sale, but corn, beans, and vegetables to feed their children. Owning land meant no more begging merchants for credit or living at the mercy of a plantation store. Yet the promise never came. Instead of land being distributed to freed families, much of it was returned to the very men who had supported the Confederacy. The plantations, including areas near Davis Bend, were reclaimed by wealthy white landowners, and they quickly pushed freedmen back into labor contracts. Those few who tried to buy land faced impossible prices or were cheated by false deeds and corrupt officials. Unless debts were signed, mules, tools, and seed were withheld, ensuring that no family could plant without owing more than they earned. Another cruel illusion became the dream of land ownership, so powerful in the years right after emancipation. At Davis Bend, hope turned to despair as families realized they would never be allowed to own the fields they had plowed for generations. Instead of building independent farms, they were forced back into a system where the soil itself became a weapon against them. The legal system in Mississippi that sided with landowners. For the freed people of Mississippi in the 1870s, the courtroom was no place of justice. Controlled by white lawmakers, judges, and sheriffs who worked hand in hand with landowners and merchants was the legal system. At Davis Bend, when families challenged unfair contracts or false debts, they found doors closed before the trial even began. That he had delivered more cotton than recorded could be presented by a freedman with witnesses or proof, but the judge would dismiss his words as worthless. Little weight against that of a white merchant carried the testimony of a black man. Court clerks delayed hearings, imposed heavy fees, or simply ignored petitions altogether. Without hesitation, sheriffs enforced eviction orders, dragging families from their cabins if they dared to resist plantation authority. Not only by the plantation store, but by the laws themselves was debt peonage reinforced. Mississippi statutes allowed landowners to seize harvests, livestock, or tools to satisfy debts that were often invented in the first place. Hunted as contract jumpers were those who fled the system, and sometimes jailed until forced back into the fields. A shield for those who profited from exploitation and a weapon against those who sought freedom became the legal system. At Davis Bend, people learned quickly that signing a contract meant surrendering not just their labor, but their voice in the eyes of the law. Another stage where the old power of slavery was dressed in the new clothing of legality became the courtroom, instead of protecting the rights of the newly freed. The generational impact. By 1873, the tragedy of Davis Bend was no longer just about the men and women who had once been enslaved. It had begun to shape the very lives of their children. From the moment they could carry a water bucket or pick cotton from the stalk, children were pulled into the cycle of labor. Often parents hoped education would be their escape. But schools in Mississippi were underfunded, targeted by hostile neighbors, or destroyed by white supremacist groups who saw literacy as a threat. At Davis Bend, children learned quickly that their future was already written in the debt ledgers of the plantation stores. When parents died or grew too weak to work, their children inherited the unpaid balance, binding them to the same land. Even marriage did not break the cycle. Young couples often discovered that both families carried debts which merged into a larger obligation. Crushed were dreams of moving away, finding work in nearby towns like Vicksburg or Natchez, by sheriffs who tracked debtors and returned them to the fields. Year after year, generations were chained to the same cotton rows under contracts designed to last forever. For the children of Davis Bend, freedom was something spoken about in church sermons and whispered at night, but never truly lived. From father to son, from mother to daughter passed the weight of false debts, until it became not only an economic system, but a way of life. A way to turn freedom itself into an inheritance had been found by the plantation economy, and it was an inheritance of bondage. The slow collapse of Davis Bend's vision. Once imagined as a beacon of progress had been Davis Bend. Freed families believed it could prove to the nation that black communities were capable of self-rule, prosperity, and independence. For a brief moment, it worked. Schools were built, churches were filled, and families organized their own councils. But by the mid-1870s, the pressure of debt, the manipulation of merchants, and the hostility of white neighbors crushed this vision. Unbearable became the false debts, draining any chance of profit from cotton harvests. Many families fled, some moving north along the Mississippi River in search of better opportunities, while others disappeared into nearby towns as wage laborers. But even those who escaped carried the scars of betrayal. Once a symbol of hope, the land itself returned to the control of white landowners who restored the old plantation order under new names. By the late Reconstruction years, Davis Bend had lost its dream of freedom. What remained was a cautionary tale about promises broken and opportunities stolen. For the freedmen who had trusted in contracts, schools, and churches, the collapse was not just material, but deeply spiritual. They had fought to prove that freedom could thrive. But the system of eternal false debts ensured that slavery survived in another form. As a story told by elders to their grandchildren lived on the legacy of Davis Bend. A story of hope that was strangled and a freedom that was promised but never delivered. Proof it stood that the end of slavery in law did not mean the end of slavery in practice.